It's my pleasure to introduce you Professor Malte Rolf. Professor Malte Rolf is now at the University of Bamberg in the wonderful region of Franconia in northern Bavaria. Well, it belongs to the land.
It does.
To Bavaria, but the Franconians are not considered themselves to be real Bavarians.
Absolutely not.
Professor Malte Rolf is a renowned specialist on the history of the Soviet Union and of Stalinism. Among his many works and articles, I would like to stress particularly his book on the Sowjetische Massenfest, Soviet mass festivals, which are actually a means to investigate notions of identity, belonging, and propaganda in the Soviet Empire. Bueno, paseo inglés en vez de Qatar, en todo caso, é un placer ter o profesor Malte Rolf tamén aquí, e probablemente unha das voces máis autorizadas para falar do tema que nos vai ocupar, que os bolxeviques e a cuestión nacional.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the introduction, also for the invitation. It's a great opportunity to present you a very distinct, unique case, although they all want to be as unique as everyone else. I think it's a good starting point for debate. But I also have to start with apology for not being able to rework this paper I sent around into an open lecture. I was struck by a very bad cold, which kind of really struck me down the last 2 days, and I haven't fully recovered. So I'm sorry, I will have to read out this paper, and I hope you have a chance to at least to have a look at the slides a little bit. I'll try not to be too fast with reading, although I'll stick to the time scale. So the Soviet Union, as you all know, was a multinational empire, and it had much in common with many other empires. But as I would like to argue, it was unique in its attempt to be the first explicit anti-imperialist empire that was built on the notions of political federation and internal nation building as part and parcel of the official propaganda. Oh yeah, right. Is that fair? Is that good? Better? Okay. This empire of nation, as Terry Martins once called it, was to be nothing else but the complete opposite to Tsarist Russia that had been overcome by the revolution of 1917. And in my paper, I want to highlight some of the guiding principles of the Bolsheviks' answer to the national question they inherited from the ancien regime. I want to analyze how the Bolsheviks interpreted the fall of the monarchy and which conclusions they drew from their interpretation. But I also want to show how the underlying assumptions of the Bolshevik national policies underwent some dramatic change during the civil war that raged Russia from 1917 to 21. And in the end, Lenin and company confirmed the unique state structure of the Soviet Union and imposed what they called the policies of indigenization, or in Russian, Karenizatsiya, kind of rooting in. And here I want to show how the inherent conflicts in the strategy to Sovietize culture and people in the empire had much to do with the rising dictatorship of Joseph Stalin. So this is what I want to at least touch today during my paper, and I don't know if I have time to come to the last point, the conclusion, which I would like to place the Soviet Union as a multi-ethnic empire in a historical perspective. So let me start with the first part, with the prison of empire. It's a question. During the second half of the 19th century, and particularly after the revolution of 1905, contemporary critical voices towards the Tsarist autocratic rule quite often refer to the imperial Russia as the prison of people, both addressing the repressive nature of autocracy in political terms, as well as the posing heavy burden of Russification and oppression in the non-Russian peripheries. Although it might be easy to dismiss this kind of critique as somewhat exaggerated and even as a national revolutionary propaganda, it is still important to keep in mind that within the political discourse of that time, the perception of the Tsarist Empire as being Russificatory, a Russificatory oppressive power, was quite common. And we will see how much this shaped the perception by the Bolsheviks when they reapproached the national question later on. But how did the Romanovs earn this kind of negative reputation? And just let me spare a few remarks on the so-called national question in the Russian Empire after 1850. As most of you know, the Russian Empire was extremely complex, just as the Soviet Union later on. It was a vast multi-ethnic and polyconfessional composited monarchy that was composed of various historical regions with very distinct ways of governing and different forms of indirect rule through local, normally non-Russian elites. The national census of 1897 gives an idea of this heterogeneity. Of 125 million people living in Russia, only 44% were ethnic Russians, another 18% Ukrainians, followed by 7% Poles and 4% Jews and many other nationalities. Ethnographers of that time intensely disputed over the number of narodnosti, nationalities, that was the term of that time, within the empire, since, of course, we all know this was a matter of contested definitions. Figures above 120 nationalities and a vast numbers of beliefs and confessional groups were usually mentioned. And even the imperial elite was a compositive one. According to the 97 census, Russian was the mother tongue of only 53% of the noble elite. So how did Petersburg try to manage this diversity? Traditionally, the peripheries of the empire had been governed by forms of indirect rule and by co-opting the local elite to Russian nobility, while leaving the social and administrative structures of the incorporated entities mostly untouched. But this traditional mode of a compositive monarchy changed dramatically after the great reforms under Alexander II. After having lost the Crimean War, Petersburg strove to modernize and thus to unify the administration of the various provinces, and in general to make the empire more homogeneous. This was in particular true for regions that, like Poland or the Caucasus, had seen local rebellions before. Here, administrative Russification, in the sense of imposing a new empire-wide structure and an external imperial bureaucracy, was pushed very far, including a linguistic Russification of all state affairs. But even in less unruly borderlands like the Baltic provinces, a tendency to further homogenize the administrative structure led to policies that were seen as Russificatory by many contemporaries in these peripheries. So in the long run, Petersburg's attempt to overcome the empire's diversity unleashed multifold discomfort, critics, and even upheaval in the borderlands, forms of reluctance that were more and more seen as a sort of national resistance against Russificatory policies of the center. Starting with the 1890s, the national questions were increasingly dominating the political discourse on the future nature of the empire, with radicalization on both sides. While, oh, excuse me, I forgot just to know where you are right now. While the imperial government and its local representatives, and who were in fact often non-Russians, were rather careful with divide et impera policies and always denied the Russificatory impetus of an imperial administration, a growing number of voices within the Russian civil society called for further privileges for the Russians. Russia for Russians was the slogan not only not only of the far-right nationalists, but also of moderate conservatives, and it kind of marked a sort of consensus among Russian political actors in the Duma and the government. On the other hand, ever more political leaders of the non-Russian nationalities saw St. Petersburg as a Russificatory and repressive power that seemed to endanger further national development. Although the secessionist camps within the non-Russian elites remained rather small, and even among the Poles, and radical revolutionaries managed to threaten the autocracy only during the turmoil of the revolution of 1905, there was a growing feeling of alienation among the national non-Russian elites during the last decade before the First World War. Little legitimacy was granted to the empire or the monarch. Few contemporaries believed that the empire could ever exit the present cauldron of national questions and inter-ethnic hatred and violence. By 1914, a broad spectrum of voices shared the notion that the empire as a compositor state would sooner or later come to an end. Thus, when the Bolshevik took over power in 1917, they were confronted with the task to maneuver their own revolutionary state through the turmoil of revolution and civil war. Soon the state became an empire of its own, now facing the Bolsheviks with a challenge to give answers to the many national questions. By doing so, Lenin and others referred to their set of knowledge and perceptions of the ills of the Tsarist empire before the war. And it's crucial to take a look at their underlying assumptions and set of beliefs that the Bolsheviks guided during the chaotic years following the October Revolution. And the Bolsheviks' analysis of the failure of the Tsarist empire, great Russian chauvinism ranked prominently as a destabilizing factor. Beside class struggle, the political repressive system, and police and military domestic violence, the Bolsheviks saw supposing Russificatory policies as one of the main reasons for people's rejection of the monarchy and the implosion of the empire in 1917. Great Russian chauvinism seemed to have offended national sentiments everywhere in the peripheries, thus destabilizing the whole empire. There were good reasons for this argument, taking into account that the revolution of 1905 proved to be most violent in the empire's borderlands, where social and national agendas of the local political actors overlapped or even merged. And we have to keep in mind that many of the younger Bolshevik leaders, like Stalin, and later also Kaganovich, Ordzhonikidze, came from these shadow zones of the empire, and thus knew the enormous potential of national mobilization and upheaval from first-hand sight. Soon after 1917, the Bolsheviks coined the term of the greater danger principle, identifying Great Russian chauvinism as the main source of turmoil and local rejection of the imperial capital, St. Petersburg. And in this perception, bourgeois nationalism was viewed as a historical anachronism that needed to be overcome. But some forms of national resistance against imperial rule, on the contrary, were acknowledged to be progressive and even seen necessary in a Bolshevik's grand historical narration. National self-determination thus became a claim which, in the Bolsheviks' view, was positively connoted, although there always remained the danger of a kind of bourgeois degeneration of this concept. And of course, as you can imagine, this was a matter of heated debate when good, non-bourgeois nationalism turned into, or national policies might turn into bad bourgeois nationalism. In any case, the slogan of the freedom of the people and the right of national self-determination figured prominently among the Bolsheviks' promises for a better future in 1917. And this, no doubt, was only partly political masquerade. In fact, having witnessed the endless national quarrels in the late Imperial Russia, many Bolsheviks leaders, and Lenin was one among them, were aware of the destabilizing effect a strong centrist and pro-Russian agenda would have in a complex multi-ethnic empire. These key assumptions underwent some changes during the raging civil war, and which I would like to focus on now during the third part of my talk. Hardly anyone believed that the Bolsheviks, as a marginal group of revolutionaries with little or no connection to the empire's peripheries, would be able to withstand the siege of a multifaceted coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces. In the end, the Bolsheviks not only won the civil war, but managed to extend the limits of their own new Red Empire almost to the former borders of Tsarist Russia. Among many other decisive factors, the Bolsheviks' ability to cooperate with a great variety of local warlords played a crucial role. Also, the fact that they were able to build coalitions with indigenous national militia or military leaders is to be pointed at here. Although the slogan of national self-determination soon after 1917 did not imply a region's succession, the last example here being allowed by the government was Finland, Red propaganda still operated with the argument or with the national cause during the Civil War. When conquering territories in the peripheries, the Red Army and the new Soviet power were less represented as an import of revolution, but as a liberation of nationalities. And in fact, the sheer existence of the Russian Federation of the Soviet Republic, the RSFSR, which had been founded in November 1917, gave some credibility to this claim. The RSFSR claimed to be a federation with administrative subunits that granted much autonomy to the regions and nationally defined territories. The Bolsheviks rushed to demonstrate that this new guiding principle of a much decentralized federation was more than paperwork. Already during the Civil War, when the Red Army overran their white enemies in the imperial peripheries, Bolshevik cultural propaganda focused much on the blossoming of nations in the cultural sphere. Moscow tried hard to create a self-image of a new form of power that was explicitly anti-imperialist and that merely helped the many non-Russian nationalities in their course of further cultural development. They also made intensive use of indigenous cultural brokers and translators at the ground, although the Bolsheviks had little doubt about that many of them were rather false friends in terms of Marxist purity. This new sort of pragmatism displayed by Moscow's missionaries in the borderlands, of course, was enforced by the bitter struggle of civil war and the Bolsheviks' relative weakness. But it gave their claims of representing a new form of power that would do more justice to local national interests, gave it some plausibility. At least the Bolsheviks had more to offer than many of the commanders of the Whites, their opponents, who promised the return to the much-hated Ancien Regime. How much the Bolshevik national policy had to adopt to the complex reality of civil war and the vastness of the new Red Empire is clearly shown in the founding of the Constitution of the Soviet Union, which was drafted shortly after the war in December 1922, and which in 1923 finally founded a unique state, the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks here remained faithful to the idea of a federal state structure, and also granted many institutions of national representations on local, republican, on all state level. Since the underlying principle of the Constitution stayed untouched until the very end of the Soviet Union in 1991, I would like to at least briefly highlight some of the key features in which, with regard to institution of national representations. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, offered a complex hierarchy of autonomous districts and republics, the latter being formally close to independent states, at least formally. In total, first 4, soon 11, and later 15 republics made up the USSR as equal partners. De jure, all the republics had their own government, ministers, etc. The republics were clearly defined as national, with a privileged titular nation running the state affairs. And to shelter the other nationalities from all sorts of chauvinistic policies from the republic's capitals, autonomous regions, districts, and even smallest village entities were created where the respective national majority had the right of political representation and cultural activity. So the guiding principle here was to territorialize nationality, a very different principle to the Habsburg idea or the Brunner idea of personal nationality. Each nation should have a territory, and all territories needed to be nationally labeled. The Soviet Union was administrated according to this principle, and I have at least an image of this vast, of the administrative subunions, of the kind of patchwork of nationally defined subunions in the USSR. In addition, certain union-wide institutions were established in Moscow that would further allow the articulation of national interests in the capital. For example, one of the chambers of that constituted the Central Executive Committee of the USSR was the Council of Nationalities. And here you have a theme of unfortunately in German, but I guess you get the idea. This is the Council of Nationalities, and it's part of the Central Executive Committee of the USSR. So the Constitution presented a federal model to an extreme that even some Bolshevik contemporaries criticized for overdoing the case and for creating a dangerous fragmentation of a revolutionary state that, at least in some minds, still strove for the world revolution. Lenin, who, due to his worsening health, by that time contributed very little to the general debate on the Constitution, but still, he and others to this form of state, to the state principle, knowing that the Bolshevik Party as an institution would be the key power structure that would unite this kind of union of nations. And indeed, it was the strictly centrist and hierarchical organization of the Communist Party that in the long run enabled Moscow to manage the constitution's complexity and to maintain control over the peripheries. Although the Bolshevik Party also displayed an image of a liberator of nation, no structure, as a party, no structure of national representation was ever institutionalized within the Communist Party. On the contrary, the guiding principle of a socialist democracy ensured the unquestioned authority of the highest executive bodies like the Politburo and the Kremlin. And in the following decades, the party served as the stabilizing moment within this federal state structure. Together with a union-wide network of growing secret service, the party enabled Moscow's leaders to make unquestioned decisions at the top and to enforce them even in the peripheries. And in particular, under Stalin, state institutions played only a subordinated role to the party within this balance of power. Therefore, many historians have neglected the importance and the potential of the federal state structure. And it is much to the US historian Terry Martin, who only a decade ago started to reconsider the role of national representation in the Soviet Union. And in the following last, how much time do I have left? Okay, we do have some more time, but in the last 10 minutes, I would like to point at this, shed some light on the Bolshevik conception of indigenization, which is in Russian korenizatsiya, to indigenize power, and how much this opened up much room for national cultural policies in the interwar period, even until 1953. So let me turn to the Empire of Nations, as Terry Martin called it. Yes, and this is the fourth part of my paper. One can translate the concept of korenizatsiya literally as rooting in, koren meaning roots, and this already well indicates the basic notion. The Bolsheviks firmly believed that only by using the local national languages, culture and cultural codes, they could bring the larger message of Marxism and revolution to the indigenous people in the empire. They had learned during the Civil War that they needed local cultural brokers to reach out to the people in the vast peripheries. And to spread some socialist ideas, they employed a national coding, or as Stalin coined it in 1925, national in form, socialist in content. Thus, korenizatsiya aimed at indigenizing Soviet rule by integrating some parts of the local ethnic elite into the new power structures, hoping that in the long run, they would be surpassed by new local communist elites more loyal to the Kremlin. For this goal, Moscow was willing to invest large resources in the spreading of the indigenous cultures of many ethnic groups. Books were published in the native languages, mother tongue schools opened up, and generally speaking, native ethnic culture was given the highest esteem in the 1920s. Within an affirmative action empire, non-Russians were explicitly privileged, staying quite faithful to the idea of an anti-imperialist empire, and having the experience of the disastrous result of Tsarist Great Russian chauvinism in mind. Especially the titular nations of the Soviet republics or their autonomous districts were entitled to proceed with forms of nation building, that is, promoting their own ethnic national culture, of course, without touching Moscow's basic political domination. It was the fundamental assumption that of the Soviet Empire of Nations that a person belonged firmly to one ethnic group and could not change this cultural heritage. And as long as the Kremlin maintained the ultimate authority, the Soviet Empire of Nations seemed to work well. In these times, the Central Party leaders hardly realized that their policy strongly promoted a nationalization of the USSR, and that it produced nationalized elites that later on could turn against Moscow. Critical voices within the communist parties, like Bukharin and others, who at the problematic aspects of nation building within a socialist state were marginalized by the argument that Russotepstvo, all forms of displays of Russian superiority, would only lead to national resistance. So the greater danger principle functioned well, and Moscow was willing to tolerate traditional features of national culture in order not to offend local elites. National cultural development was interpreted as a necessary historical phase that only in the long run would lead towards a common classless socialist society. All of this opened up much room for blossoming of small nations during the 1920s. The national census of 1926 counted 176 officially acknowledged nationalities that all in one form or another had the right to develop or spread their national culture. But already during the last years of the post-revolutionary decade, tensions grew. By 1929, a younger generation of revolutionaries felt alienated within their own state, that by acclamation was supposed to be a socialist state, while in fact traditional social structures and also national structures were still dominant, not only in the peripheries. Reports on local communists actively participating in traditional or even religious rituals poured oil into the flames of revolutionary radicalism at that point of time. Obviously, the goal of Sovietizing the people in the USSR had produced very little success by the end of the 1920s. And Stalin made use of this discomfort of younger communists, and historians have rightly identified this time period called the so-called Cultural Revolution, which stretched from 1929 until more or less 1933. They have identified this period as the foundation of Stalin's later personal dictatorship. It was a time when the whole idea of a state-sponsored nation building came under attack, and the established national elites in the peripheries were suspected of being disloyal, or even worse, as bourgeois counter-revolutionary. Many of the local nationalist communists were now purged during these years, and Moscow tried to intensify its control over the republics in general. Overall, the number of officially acknowledged nationalities was now reduced during the 1930s from 176 to only 69. So cut down to half. And there's an anecdote saying that Stalin actually pinned down this number personally, saying that the professionals proposed like 80 nationalities, and he said this is still too much, we have to compose them, and it should be not more than 70. So they ended up with 69 officially acknowledged nationalities. But even all these facts mentioned here, we should not misinterpret it as a clear sign that the importance of the category of nationalities was losing its importance during Stalinism. First of all, some institutional continuities might help to demonstrate that nationality remained an important category. For example, the Soviet nationality formally remained one of the highest state organs, the Soviet of Nationality, the Council of Nationality, remained one of the highest state organs, even in the constitution, in the Stalinist constitution of 1935. But much more than that, as Terry Martin, Yuri Sloskin, Jörg Barbarovsky, and others have shown, national categories as a kind of fixed, officially ascribed classification became even more relevant during the 1930s. First of all, the basic notion of an empire of nation stayed untouched. Sloskin once called the Soviet Union of the 1930s, during Stalinism, as a communal apartment in which clearly defined and differentiated nationalities lived in separate rooms. And there is much truth to this image. The Stalinist USSR nationally turned nationality into a strict identifier of each individual that was objectively defined by the state, ascribed, and that could not be changed, for example, by forms of acculturation. In consequence, nationality became a fixed category indicated even in the passport of every Soviet citizen. Corresponding propaganda in Stalin's time celebrated the colorful panorama of the large Soviet family of the people, or respectively their friendship, and I just have two images here. But still, the basic notion of an empire of nation remained untouched, and it remained the guiding principle even during Stalinism. Although no doubt the general framework of an overarching Soviet culture was much more emphasized during these years. Numerous propaganda displays depicted the new Soviet man and Soviet culture as a kind of transnational cement of the USSR as a multinational empire. During the 1930s, the party state invested increasing resources to further Sovietize the national cultures and integrating them into a Soviet high culture, and even using Russian as the imperial lingua franca became more important, and this also meant pushing Russian language schools in the peripheries. At the latest, starting with the Second World War, Russians in general became more privileged as a first among equal nation in the USSR. But even not dismissing these factors and not dismissing that there was a stronger emphasis on a Russian-based Soviet high culture that now was now being displayed. Still, the underlying notion of the USSR as a multinational empire based on the diversity of separate and officially sponsored nationalities was never abandoned. The Soviet Union remained an empire of nations until its very end. I don't know if I think I'm already over time, so maybe I'll skip here you have the perfect representation of this kind of new Soviet high culture. Everyone formed into emerging into one Soviet large mass of Soviet people, but still depicted as specific nationally defined subunions. And I hope you can see, these standardized national representations here on the propaganda image. So maybe just to conclude with one more sentence, I think the shared notion is that the shared horizon of for many contemporaries, and also during Stalinism, but also later on after '53, after Stalin's death, the shared horizon was a strongly nationalized worldview that accepted the national categories as a cultural norm for all kinds of different cultural and political activities. So we can hardly draw a clear boundary between what was defined as socialist on the one side and national on the other. Quite on the contrary, these categories widely overlapped for contemporaries, including the communists, and thus it opened up space for different and competing forms of fusion and cross-cutting of national and socialist element. Nationalizing socialism was a contested field of debate and practices, but it was a kind of common denominator of communication between the regime and the society, and this it stayed until 1991, until the very end of the Soviet Empire. Thank you for your attention.
Dankeschön.